Welcome aboard. It's episode 91 of the J.R. Hef Show. I am pleased to be joined today by Ambassador Jim Gilmore. Ambassador Gilmore was most recently the ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which you will find out all about what that organization is in this podcast. We talk about a number of things that face America in terms of its foreign policy and particular challenges with the great power competition between Russia and the United States and China and the United States. We also go into what happened over this summer in Afghanistan and what dynamic that plays within Europe and again to our partners, folks who are looking up to the U.S. For strength and security, as well as to our competitors. So that was a really good conversation with the ambassador. Then we go in and talk about domestic policy, particularly spending in Congress, as well as what's happening here in the Commonwealth of Virginia and our elections coming up here in November. So a wide-ranging conversation with the ambassador, super informative. I think you're going to really enjoy it. And so without further ado, let's get underway with Ambassador Jim Gilmore. Ambassador Jim Gilmore, welcome to the podcast.
Good. Thanks very much, JR.
It's great to have you back. Last spoke to you in 2017, and there's been quite a lot of water under the bridge since then, including your being appointed to ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is a great billet under the Trump administration. That's how did that happen from going to being a presidential candidate and a governor to actually being nominated and serving as an ambassador?
Well, once the President Trump was elected, I just simply let it be known that at that point I would like an opportunity to serve in the diplomatic corps if that could be possible. Of course, as you know, the president gets a lot of political appointees. My belief is that the political appointees are more important than the staff appointees, that the career appointees, which is a little countercultural. People think that it's the other way around, but I think the political appointees add a great deal. So I asked for an opportunity. And after some consideration by the Trump administration, they offered me the multilateral organization of Vienna, Austria. But JR, it's a great billet. It's 57 countries, all of Europe, the Caucasus, Central Asia, Turkey, Russia, and Ukraine, all of Western Europe. It deals with all of the national security issues surrounding Europe and really almost the Northern Hemisphere.
Yeah, so I think most of us are familiar with the United Nations. They're familiar with NATO. They're obviously familiar with the European Union, but maybe not as familiar with OSCE, although, back even to its predecessor organization, CSCE, it's been involved in diplomacy and negotiations and treaties all the way back to the 1970s. Let's dig into the organization a little bit more and get a greater understanding. As I did a little research, it looks a lot like the United Nations, only it's focused on the European theater.
I think that's right. And I can make some comparisons with the other organizations you mentioned. But OSCE was established back by the Helsinki Accords. Your viewers can look that up. It was an agreement made primarily between Russia and the United States, but not exclusively. The organization has grown to 57 countries. There is a certified ambassador from each of those countries. It meets once a week in the Hofburg Palace, the same way the UN meets in its offices in New York City, to frankly state the positions of the various countries on the critical security issues of the day. One of the key issues there is Ukraine. They have a very large monitoring mission for the OSCE in Ukraine. We're looking at that conflict. But they're involved in all the issues of national security, human rights, and basically the standards of Western civilization. While I was there, I met every week with the Quad, which is the British, the French, the Americans, and the Germans. I met every week with the Ukrainian ambassador, the European Union ambassador, the Canadian ambassador, and other key figures across Europe in order to carry out and project American influence and leadership. It's a great organization. I really enjoyed it very much. Very high caliber diplomats are assigned to it because it is international. Just to make a quick comparison, The United Nations is better known because it's higher profile. It's in the media center of New York, and it's been high profile ever since the Cuban Missile Crisis. But it's scattered. It just has so many things that it's dealing with. It's very difficult for it to focus. The United Nations is one organization. NATO is another. It's a very key alliance, the key alliance, but the Russians aren't in it and really won't talk to it and consider it an adversary. The European Union is basically an economic sort of budding, trying to become a nation, which I think they never really will. But the Russians don't like the European Union either. But in OSCE, the Russians are there. They're active, they're present, they confront the Americans directly and we them. But it's not just them, it's the key areas of friction and tension throughout the entire European continent writ large.
Well, what's interesting is mentioned at the outset, again, this organization transcended the Cold War, from the 1970s all the way to the 1990s. And now we're back into that era of great power competition. What was your relationship with the Russian ambassador?
First of all, it was personally very good. I actually liked the Russian ambassador, and I liked the people, the other key staff people that worked for him very much. But I never forgot that they represented Russia, and they're looking after Russia's interests and trying to carry a Russian foreign policy, which I'm sorry to say is pretty aggressive. So the United States had to be confrontive of them in the permanent council meetings and project not only a message to the Russians, but also to all the other 56 countries that are in that room, that the United States is there, it's strong, it's participating, and we're providing security leadership really worldwide. So while I had a good personal relationship, the relations between the United States and Russia were adversarial. There's no question about that. But still, it was an opportunity to have direct communication in that organization. Well, by the way, JR, I might say one thing. As a policy, the United States ambassador did not meet with the Russian ambassador one-on-one. And the reason was because of Crimea. We did not want to project to the Russians that, well, all's forgiven and now we're going to go back to business as usual. However, I've just told your viewers that this is the one place where, outside of the UN even, where the United States and Russia are actually together. So I began to have meetings with the Russians one-on-one towards the end of my term there. And I found those meetings to be productive and constructive, although nobody was giving up on exactly where we are in the world and the American and Russian positions.
Well, the media made a big deal during the Trump administration about potential influence in the 2016 elections. They made a big deal about the relationship between President Trump and President Putin, and made it seem as if that there was some sort of cozy relationship with Russia. How did that influence or impact your time as the ambassador?
You can go on the OSCE, United States, US OSCE website, and you can see my archive statements. If there was any cozy relationship between Trump and Putin, the Jim Gilmore as ambassador didn't get the memo, because our job there, and we were in complete coordination with the State Department, was to hold the line and project American strength and leadership. Also, JR, you make reference to the media. The media also played a lot during the Trump administration that there was this antagonism and division between the United States and its warmest allies. I did not find that in Vienna. We were very close to the Germans, the French, the British in the Quad. We all knew we were on the same side. We were all coordinating policy together. And it was beyond that. And again, I never asked any of these countries to give up their own national interests. But the fact is that the United States interests and the interests of almost all those countries coincided, and we all knew it. So this myth that they had of division was not being played out at OSCE in Vienna.
Well, there's two questions that come immediately to mind, and we'll take them one at a time. One is on Afghanistan, and the other is on the president's initial approachment to NATO and to the G7 countries on this sort of, I would call it like a reapproachment victory tour. That was how it was being portrayed in the media. So basically what I'm hearing from you is that there was not an antagonism between our closest allies in Europe and the United States, that actually was very strong. It just was being misportrayed.
It was, our relationship was very strong, cooperative, friendly. I can assure you that the first thing that I did when I got to Europe was began to bond up with the ambassador from the United Kingdom. But he wasn't the only one.
Oh no, I'm sure of it. The French, the Germans, Spanish, Italians. I'm sure you had conversations with everyone.
With everyone, but also with a lot of the countries in Europe that used to be under the Soviet sword, so to speak. They're now independent, and they're counting on the United States to be strong so that they can remain sovereign and independent. Nobody in Eastern Europe wants to go back under the command of the Russians. Nobody does, but they do rely upon American leadership so that they have the self-confidence to know that they can maintain that sovereignty.
No, absolutely. And we're going to get to Afghanistan here in a second, because it's one of the 57 countries that's actually part of OSCE. I find that very interesting. I really want to get your thoughts on that. But personally, I was deployed to the Republic of Georgia after the Russians went after Ossetia. And so, I kind of saw their antagonism firsthand and saw what they did to Georgia. So I was really surprised, but not surprised by what happened with the little green men in Crimea in 2014. So with that as the backdrop, can you explain in greater detail to all of us what that dynamic is with the former Soviet states, particularly around the Baltic?
I will. Georgia is the example you mentioned. They are quite determined to not go back into the Russian Empire. They're very determined. And they never stopped expressing appreciation for my statements that I was making in support of Georgia. The Baltics, the same way. They're very independent. They're sovereign. They're ethnically different. Their language is different. They do not intend to go back under the Russian Empire. True for Romania, Hungary, Poland. And I think that it's very vital that the U.S. project strength and to be a leader. That leadership is something that people want in Europe and throughout the entire Northern Hemisphere. So it was a really strong relationship, and I think we made a lot of progress. I was determined to bond up very closely to our closest allies and to build relationships and confidence among many of the other countries too. This organization also goes out into Central Asia as well.
Mm. So the situation in Crimea specifically, again, back in February of, I want to say it was 2014, early March, was when the Russians chose to try to seize the Crimea. Now, as you mentioned, there are security monitors there. What has transpired in the 7 years in Ukraine?
Well, the monitors on in Crimea because the Russians have claimed that, and they exclude everybody as being part of their territory, which the United States or anybody else, none of us recognize that. And we're not going to recognize that. That's a conquest that disrupts the entire security order of Europe, and we can't allow it to stand. I might mention in passing that the Russians also have troops in Moldova. They have troops in Georgia, that we know that they are heavily influencing through proxies, the people in eastern Ukraine. So they have a national strategy, JR. Their intention is to do everything they can do to extend Russian influence and to try to reassemble that Russian empire. I don't think they can do it. They can try to do it by force, which then circles us back, of course, to Afghanistan. But I was just in Ukraine after I got back from OSCE. I was actually invited to the American Foreign Policy Council to lead a delegation to Ukraine. And I went there. We met with about 14 cabinet officials in Ukraine. Their message was consistent, their intention to be sovereign, to build their own country, to not be under the Russian goal, and to try to, frankly, be a part of NATO. But they also, by the way, just interestingly enough, they took me down into the Sea of Azov and out onto the Sea of Azov, where we actually went out and saw one of the Russian picket ships out there in the Sea of Azov off the Ukrainian coast. And also they took me actually onto the battlefield out there at eastern Ukraine, and I had a chance to look over that area as well. But the direct answer is, in that 7 years, The Ukrainians are stronger, they're more independent, and they're very determined to be independent and sovereign. And they do not any longer see the Russians as their blood brothers because the Russians have been so aggressive towards them.
Well, a British warship was in international waters in the Baltic Sea off the coast of the Ukraine recently. And the Russians sent aircraft again. They're claiming that they dropped a bomb. The British were saying, no, that never happened. But clearly the tensions there are there. When you were the ambassador, what was your relationship with NATO or perhaps even European Command?
Very strong. Once again, the NATO has its own headquarters in Brussels. They have their own United States ambassador to NATO as well. It was Kay Bailey Hutchinson during my term that I was there. However, we had a NATO caucus at OSCE. Those countries got together once a week and conferred over NATO and national security issues through the NATO process, even though we were the ambassadors located in Vienna, Austria. So the link up was really quite close. And national security policy was close. The Vienna document is a previously agreed to document where both sides always notified people about exercises in Europe. Russia has been very resistant to that. They were in it, but now they're very resistant to it. And modernization is something they don't want to do. But that came out of the OSCE through our partnership with NATO.
So let's talk about the Russians and their building of pipelines, because one of the ways that they want to influence is obviously through the energy sector and also to gain in their economic, prowess and have Europe be more dependent upon them for energy. The U.S. did have sanctions on Russia recently, but President Biden pulled them. And you wrote a column about this. Talk a little bit more about I want to say it's the Northeast 2 pipeline. That may be correct. Maybe not.
Nord Stream 2.
Nord Stream 2. Why is this such an important topic?
Because if the Russians build a pipeline to Western Europe, specifically to Germany, and start supplying fuel and gas into Western Europe, they will grow more dependent upon Russian energy. Also, that pipeline bypasses Ukraine, which is intended. It's intended to continue to further isolate Ukraine and try to once again bring them back within the Russian orbit. So it has geopolitical consequences, but the U.S. has discouraged it and has in fact put sanctions on it because we think it's not in the American interest that our friends in Western Europe grow dependent upon Russian energy. But I'm frankly puzzled. Once again, you made reference to the fact that they said that President Trump was sort of soft on Russia. He's the one that put the sanctions on the pipeline. President Biden took the sanctions off the pipeline and said basically, okay, go ahead and do it. It's fait accompli, he said. You can just go ahead and just build it. I give up. I don't know why he did that. Simultaneously, of course, he was taking the American pipeline and stopping it, the American pipeline that's being built in the United States. So why would you stop American natural resources from being created, energy resources being created, and enable that same resource to be delivered into our allies, making them dependent? I'm puzzled by that. And that's why I wrote that article in opposition to it.
We were making such great progress towards being energy independent and seeing the pipelines being shut down or ceasing to be constructed has been a little disappointing. And I understand, the fact that we want to have a more cleaner climate for sure. That's not to be disputed. However, at the sake of our national security and at the sake of our energy independence, it just kind of seems a little unwise to me, which leads me to Afghanistan. We are recording this mere days after the Taliban took Kabul. It will air. This airs on September 14th. So we're going to be a few weeks time late on this. So we're not going to talk about this in terms of current events. But let's talk about it in terms of what message has the United States sent by, number one, not necessarily confronting Russia strongly in this great power competition, and then also seemingly abdicating the Afghanis in prematurely. Let's just say it that way. What are your thoughts?
Well, I will probably be writing some more on this later, but right now I want to be a little more general on this podcast and to say that it is not a good situation in Afghanistan. The chaotic way that this is being handled sends a terrible message of American weakness. America was basically begging the Taliban to not attack us and that we would get out on their timetable. And that once they began to enter into that area, that, well, we would send in troops to secure the airport, but that it was just a terrible, chaotic situation. I think it sends a terrible message. Number one, I think it sends a terrible message to the people of Afghanistan, that they were actually emerging into a more modern society. Their women were given the opportunity to participate. The American ambassador from Afghanistan to OSCE is a woman. And, there are other advancements that Afghanistan was making that now they're being thrown back. So the message to the Americans is we're looking after ourselves and we're not looking after them. I don't think I can think of any reason why the Afghan people need to stand up for themselves if they think they're alone, particularly with the ugly things that have been said. But I have more to say about this later. But I think I want to say the most important thing, this sends a message into the minds of two groups that worry me. Number one, all of these groups that I tried to reach out to and project strength of America in Europe are now looking at this and saying, well, wait a minute, if we get pushed up against us here in Europe, are the Americans really going to be with us? So is Gilmore just blowing smoke? And I can tell you that when I was there, I was not blowing smoke. I had the complete authority of the State Department and the Trump administration to be strong and to stand with our friends in Europe. The second group, and this worries me the most, is Russia and China.
Right.
I'm really worried about the Ukraine situation and maybe about the Taiwan situation. There is a calculation going on in both China and in Russia right now. They have foreign policies that are very aggressive, that are very expansionist, and they see those two countries as very pivotal for their future. If Taiwan remains independent, that means that there's a Chinese ethnic people who can be independent, sovereign, and have a democracy. That is something that Beijing doesn't want to have exist. They don't want their own billion people to be able to see something like that. That's why they just eliminated the democracy in Hong Kong against their previous agreements. Russia is even more important in my view, because Russia definitely does not want a Russia-type people that used to be part of the Soviet Union to have an independent, sovereign democracy. If they do, why shouldn't the rest of the Russian people have an independent, sovereign democracy and throw out people like Putin and these authoritarians? That's why they can't allow Ukraine to move to the West. And right now, there's danger. JR, there's serious danger that they might actually make a mistake and pull the trigger and do a real invasion of Ukraine. They've threatened it constantly. If they do, then all of the history of Europe and maybe of the world is on a pivot. What will President Biden do? Frankly, I don't think that's a decision he ought to put himself into a position that he has to make.
So, Governor Gilmore, let's move on real quick and try to finish up the podcast as best we can with the technical difficulties that I'm facing. We can see you just fine. We can hear you just fine. So we'll just continue with you on video. Nobody wants to look at me anyway. So Ambassador Gilmore, let's talk about now. Pivot again to the Chinese. You had mentioned their situation with Taiwan. What message do you think we have sent to the Taiwanese? Do you think that they still consider us a strong ally?
I think we need to get out of the media and have these direct communications with Taiwan. But lately we have sent arms to Taiwan. We have been sending ships through the Taiwan Strait. So we are doing everything we can do to send a strong message to the Chinese to not invade, not to make a mistake, because that the U.S. is quite likely to, in fact, respond in a positive way. And I support that. But I think that the Afghan message is when the chips are down and it's really tough, the U.S. Plans to get out. But look, this Afghanistan thing is a very complicated matter. I'm not suggesting in this podcast that we need to stay there forever, the way that the implication is. Well, we could stay there we could stay there and do some things. If we had some presence there, a military presence there like we had, the risk is quite low. And yet at the same time, we'd be sending a strong message, not just to the Taliban, but to everybody else, that the U.S. is available to step things up if things get too bad. That way you could actually protect the people of Afghanistan. I just think that this all or nothing idea is not necessary for a power as great as the United States of America. It is true that you don't want to be bogged down into places that are not central to your national security. That's true. But I don't think we're bogged down. This is not Vietnam where we're sending hundreds of thousands of soldiers in all the time. This is not a place where we have to expend all this money. That's just sort of the American way, but we don't have to do that. We could continue to keep our hand in without dropping things overnight off a cliff. And that's what we just did. And I think that sends a terrible message. The question that the Chinese have to be asking themselves is this. If they decide to pull the trigger at last and retake the Taiwan and pay all the costs that will involve with all the death and all the destruction, are they willing to do it? And the answer is if the U.S. is at risk of actually coming in behind the Taiwanese, the risk is too great. But if they see that the U.S. is withdrawing and pulling back and becoming more isolationist, maybe they'll think that the odds are pretty good here. And then if they pull the trigger, then the U.S. has to make a tough decision. And I think that our policy ought to be to avoid putting ourselves in a position where we have to make that decision. We should stand by Taiwan.
Definitely, we should stand by Taiwan. And that leads me to, again, these spending bills that came out over this past summer. We've had in the spring, there was a $1.9 trillion spending package. Then we had the infrastructure spending package of over $1 trillion. And now we've got the $3.5 trillion spending spree, the largest expansion of government since the Great Society and LBJ. My question resides with the amount of debt that the United States has and how much China holds that debt. Would they put their interests in Taiwan above the amount of debt that they actually hold in the United States?
That's just a great question. I think that American economists think that they would not do something reckless militarily because of the economic interrelationship between the United States and China. I'm not so sure. I think that great powers are capable of conducting lots of different kinds of policies all at the same time. And that's what we should do. I want to repeat, JR, the United States is the greatest power in the world. Everybody knows it. We should not be sitting around here worrying about American power, strength, or influence or leadership because we are the most powerful country in the world. But I believe that we have to calculate the risk here that the Chinese might make a mistake. Maybe their military people are more powerful than their economic people. Maybe they think that they can just run their economy without the United States. So I think that this still has to continue to develop.
So let's bring that question back home here. Part of that spending bill happened to support Virginia, and our General Assembly had a lack of debate. They didn't even discuss it. Really, it was just the governor's budget that was sort of a fait accompli. And you had a good proposal, though, and it's honestly, it was the no car tax, right? We go back to when you were governor, and 70% of the no car tax had actually gone through up until the millennia. And then when Democrats got elected, Mark Warner in particular, the car tax phase out went away. And honestly, I think for Republicans in Virginia, that was the last great message we actually had. I mean, with all due respect to Governor McDonnell and Bob's for Jobs, I think, the no car tax really was specific. It was a specific issue. And Republicans had a winner. Ironically, that's really, other than Bob McDonnell, that's the last time we won. So what's going on with the car tax, and what do you think will put, number one, what do you think of the current situation in Richmond with the Democrats in power? And number two, do you think Republicans can ever get back on message again?
Well, let me start by talking about some of this finances that you led us to, which I think is the right issue. And I can talk about the politics maybe in a subsequent question, but I want to keep focused on this. Now that I'm back from Vienna, I am re-engaged in Virginia politics because I think that Virginia is really hurting not just its own people, but they're hurting everybody in America by sending our representatives to Washington that we send. and the policies that we've been following in Richmond and in Washington. So I want to do something about that. It is true nationally that we're seeing a torrent of taxing and spending that's coming in. And it's an entirely different philosophy. When I was governor, we were trying to push the car tax because the philosophy was we want to give the public back more of their own money to do what they want to with it. We wanted to put that responsibility and that opportunity back on people. That's not what's going on now. What's going on now is that we're celebrating the maximum possible taxation and the maximum possible spending. This is a torrent of money that's being spent by the United States Congress. As you point out, there are actually 3 different spending programs that President Biden is trying to implement. They just did this so-called infrastructure plan, but it contains a lot of stuff in it that has nothing to do with infrastructure. And it's a lot of money, $621 billion at the national level. Then they want to add to that right now another $3.5 trillion of additional spending. And it had nothing to do with infrastructure. And they're trying to leverage one against the other. And that ain't all. They already passed a so-called COVID relief plan, which is what this Richmond money is really all about. That's another $1.9 trillion at the national level. And they got another one coming, which is a $1.8 trillion on something they're calling the family plan. JR, this is a torrent of money. It's unprecedented. We haven't seen anything like this before. And it offers to redefine the nature of Americans to their national government. And that is exactly what I was trying to make reference to in Virginia. We're trying to give more money back to the people to do what they want to do with their own money, not being siphoned through the federal government. They're taxing too much if they've got all this money. Now, on the Virginia side, they had the audacity to send all this money, another $4.2 billion to Virginia, and they called it COVID relief or infrastructure or something like that. But the truth is that there's just all kinds of stuff that's in this bill that doesn't belong in this bill. And it's an enormous amount of money. They didn't do it with any Republican participation at all. So there's no check and balance right now in Richmond at all on the spending of all this money. Now, look, all the money that's in there, there's a lot of pork barrel in it. I found a lot of it. And your public really ought to go on the VPAP website and really look at this budget in Virginia that was just passed. And you'd be amazed at some of the things that are in it. You know, millions and millions of dollars, for example, for a monument on African-American landing at Fort Monroe. Just all these kinds of things that are in this thing. There's a lot of stuff on all the different Christmas trees that Virginia, the legislature wanted to spend. It's a complete change of approach and philosophy that's a real problem in my view. And that's because we just don't have anything except big taxes and spenders, either in Washington or in Richmond.
So I guess that leads to the second part of the question is how do, again, Republicans get on message? How are we able to actually communicate to a broad enough coalition, broad enough demographic in order to win again? As you know, I mean, the entire General Assembly, all 100 are up for election. So there's an opportunity there. Heck, the last time we talked, Republicans had a 66-34 majority in the General Assembly. We saw how quick that evaporated. So there still, though, is a chance for us to retake the General Assembly if we want to, or if we have a good, strong message. Along with that, we've got Mark Herring trying for his unprecedented 3rd term as Attorney General. And then you've got the campaign for Lieutenant Governor and Terry McAuliffe wanting to make a comeback, be the comeback kid here for his 2nd term as governor. By the way, I'd like to maybe see you consider that again, but we'll get in your political aspirations down the road here. But anyway, how do we manage this going the next few months here to the campaign in November?
Well, I think we have to decide on the message to be sure, JR. I mean, I just think that we do have to think about this. First of all, yes, I did write an article recently saying the truth, which is that the car tax cut has been frozen now for over 20 years. The budget of Virginia has tripled during that period of time. I got a 70% off with the lower budget of at that time. It's now tripled. And over those years, not one additional cent has gone to begin to rephase out the car tax. Never mind the car tax. I didn't write this article because I thought that everybody was going to run down to Capitol Hill at the last minute and embrace a car tax cut. What I was trying to do was to remind the people of Virginia that they voted for a tax cut like that so that they could have more of their own money and that they've been betrayed. That's what I was simply trying to do. Now, if the Republicans chose to run on it, they could do that, but they could run on any kind of tax cut, which puts more money back into the pockets of working men and women. But instead, what we're seeing is this torrent of money being spent down at the General Assembly. And I would encourage the public of Virginia to go on the VPAP webpage and look at that budget. That's the only place I could find it, by the way. I couldn't find it on any of the official websites. So the point is that we just have a great deal more to redefine what politics is really like in Virginia. And I think people may very well be ready for a change. What are we seeing right now? In the central cities across America, and even in Virginia, we're seeing mass killings every night. Law and order is completely breaking down. The message of the Democratic Party nationally and in Virginia is they don't like the police. They don't like the sheriffs. They don't think there should be any law enforcement. All the reforms, so-called reforms that were made in the last General Assembly were anti-law enforcement reforms. No-knock provisions, legalization of marijuana, the elimination of the death penalty. Now, look, I was governor of Virginia. I didn't like the death penalty either. But I think it deters people from doing the most terrible things. If you remove that, you're basically sending a message that the ultimate penalty is just not available. So it just reduces that risk of this terrible misconduct. I think people are mad about education. Education is not good. I've seen some terrible reports lately about how our kids are not being given the education they need to equip themselves to do the most fundamental things in the 21st century. Instead, education is now being used to propagandize our kids and to explain to them why either they're racist or they're not racist. They should be racist. It's, there should be equity as opposed to education. I don't think people want to send their kids to the public schools to be propagandized and to be told what they're supposed to think. I mean, that's the role really of the parents. So I think that there's a difference in that. I think that the COVID thing is at least a diversion. And it's a real problem because the people of Virginia are so focused on COVID and the media is so focused on COVID, they can't think about the issues of taxing and spending, law enforcement and public safety, and education. And that's the places where I think Republicans can concentrate their attention so that it matters whether we win in November. We're not just putting people up just to put them up. We've got to put people up in order to do the right thing down at the General Assembly. And that's the way things have not been going on over the last couple of years with complete Democratic dominance.
Well, that's the thing that concerns me about these elections every single time. Honestly, I think if Republicans were able to communicate or be listened to for any reasonable amount of time, I think reasonable people would say, wow, okay, I agree with that. I think that's a really good policy. The problem is that the media definitely carry the Democrats' water, and the messaging against Republicans makes even the proudest Republican want to crawl under a rock sometimes because they're so demonized. It's a situation where I think it's really difficult for Republicans to get past this notion that they're racist. They don't care about kids. They want to run kids down with black SUVs and trucks or anything like that. I mean, these kind of ridiculous ads that were run within the last week between the campaign between Northam and Gillespie. And lo and behold, within the first few months of the Northam administration, we've got him on his page in a Ku Klux Klan outfit and blackface. So how do Republicans break through to people who aren't really paying attention a lot enough for them to be able to understand that Republicans are not evil and they have their best interests in mind?
Well, I've looked at the vote totals and they've sure been going the wrong way the last number of years, but that's because people in the suburbs, especially mothers in the suburbs, but women in the suburbs, younger women who are professionals, have been voting Democrat. And the consequence of that is higher taxes, lousy education, and danger in the cities. People in the suburbs may not care, but I care. I care about the community in the cities being in danger all the time and their kids being lured away into gangs and getting killed themselves. I think that's a terrible situation, and we owe it to the people in the suburbs, the cities, and in the rural areas to deal with some of these issues. Drugs are a real problem. So what do? We send a message that marijuana is okay. Now, you can argue about the details, but that's a fact. We have now sent a legalization of marijuana, which implies that the use of drugs is okay. And this is not what we ought to be doing. It leads into very dangerous situations, overdoses, fentanyl, serious problems out there that lead to deaths in the community. Things are not going the right way. If we talk about the right messaging, if we talk about education, taxes and spending, law enforcement, and to explain that we want to go in a different direction, I think we can get those votes in places like Fairfax County and Henrico and Chesterfield and Virginia Beach, and we can win the election.
Ambassador Gilmore, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I know that we're probably running very short on time here. I do want to ask you, though. I mean, you have been around for more than 2 decades as a prosecutor, as attorney general, as governor. You ran a couple of campaigns. You ran for president. You've been ambassador. How do you see the rest of your life of service playing out? Are you going to kind of be the free commenter, or is there another role for you in public service?
Well, right now, what my plan is to get in and try to help the Republican Party and to help the state of Virginia. I went to Europe as an ambassador because I wanted to help the United States of America. That's it. I actually gave up a lot in my private life and my business life that I can't recapture by going to Europe as an ambassador. I'm glad I did it. I had an opportunity to serve the people of the United States in international affairs, and I think that I did a good job. Now I'm back. And my job now is to serve the people of the United States and the people of Virginia by trying to help the party get reelected and do the right thing. So that's my goal. And then in addition to that, I've been offered an opportunity to participate on a lot of international issues because of my work as ambassador. I'm having a chance to write things and publish them in journals, both in Virginia and nationally, to try to influence American foreign policy and to speak out on the issues. I've gained a lot of opportunity to have a lot of experience doing a lot of things. And I think that, I have a right to speak out on these issues and try to be helpful to my fellow citizens. And that's what I'm doing.
Ambassador Gilmore, it's absolutely fantastic to talk to you. Thank you so much for doing this. Where can folks find out more about you and maybe follow you a little bit better?
Oh, I'm on a web page, and, I've got an email address, james.s.gilmore@gmail.com. That's my personal email. And I've got a LinkedIn and a Facebook page and a LinkedIn page, and I've addressed people through social media. So there's plenty of opportunities to work with me.
Ambassador Gilmore, absolutely a pleasure. Any final thoughts?
Just this. I think that I would like to impress upon people the serious danger internationally. There is a real danger that's emerging that didn't exist back when Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev were trying to resolve things, and things were calmer, and things are not calm now. I think things are very dangerous. We are so distracted in the United States of America by COVID and by the issues, the social issues that have been raised about race, that we're not thinking about anything else. We've got to think about the international danger, and we've got to reassess what kind of country and what kind of state we really want to have. And that is a decision, frankly, for the voters, and they get an opportunity to make that decision this year in Virginia and next year in the Congress.
Ambassador Jim Gilmore, thank you so much for joining us, sir.
Thank you, J.R.